Hi, I'm Glenn Adamson. I'm Deputy Head of Research at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and I'm here with Dr. J.D. Hill from the British Museum, and we're going to talk a little bit about curating the global. J.D., I wanted to ask you about your activities at the British Museum, and particularly this project about 100 objects that are tracking the history of the globe.
Okay. What I'm currently working at the moment is I lead a team of curators and experts, and we're writing a 100-part radio series which uses objects to tell a narrative history of the world over the last 2 million years.
Right. So my own activities in the global, I suppose, would be mainly centered around the concept of postmodernism at the moment. This is an exhibition that I'm curating for the V&A that will be on view in autumn of 2011. And the problem of postmodernism is, I suppose, it's in a way the opposite of the problem that you face, because your problem is about time, your problem is about selection, our problem is about interpretation. So obviously the term postmodernism itself, but also the question of where and when. When did postmodernism happen? Where did it happen? Just in Milan, for example, and New York perhaps, or did it happen all over the globe? So this is something we've been wrestling with at the moment.
But surely both our projects have the same fundamental problem of you only have a limited number of objects to tell a story. So in terms of global narratives, how are you addressing that in the object choice?
Yeah, we have about 200 objects, maybe more than that, to play with for our exhibition, and it has to cover a wide swath of genres as well, so design, architecture, photography, crafts, fashion, etc. Basically the whole run of what the V&A owns and what they
Do they all come from the V&A?
No. We'll be doing lots of loans as well. I suppose all your 100 objects are probably British Museum objects.
Yes, it was simpler that way.
Yeah, it's also a bit of a promotion of the British Museum as a global institution.
Of course.
Right. This is interesting as well. We both represent these institutions that can claim to have a kind of world purview. Although we do not do Africa and Latin America at the V&A, which is interesting in itself. It's interesting in itself because the history of colonialism and empire, of course, is very strongly marked in both our institutions. And in the case of the V&A, I would say that the reason that we don't have African and Latin American material is that in the 19th century, when the collection was begun, those areas of the world were not considered to make art. They were considered to make artifacts, yes, but not art, and that's why you do Africa and Latin America, isn't it? We don't.
Yes, I think, well, we're the legacy of an 18th century organisation which didn't discriminate at all in what it collected. But I think what's quite interesting is this interesting relationship between the British Museum and the V&A. We both collect and have collections which are very similar, other than the fact that we have Africa and South America. We will collect the same for objects as you. So I think the interesting question in terms of how we curate the global is the different approaches we're, as institutions, we're both taking to this material. It's almost the same material.
Yes, we might take the same object and present it in completely different contexts. For us, it would probably be a story about style, maybe a story about ownership of a single person. For you, it would be a representation of a kind of cultural norm, perhaps.
I think it's far more about culture history, I would say, because that comes back to also down sense we collect the same things as even Tate collects. So we collect contemporary Middle Eastern art, and I think one of the really interesting questions about curating the global is why we collect now what we're going to collect, and how, for example, different is the British Museum collecting a piece of contemporary art from the Middle East and what it does with that compared to what Tate does.
One thing you've done that's very interesting relatively recently, is this Enlightenment Gallery. And that's quite striking to me because the V&A has no heart. We don't have one space where we say this is what we're about. And in a way, the Enlightenment Gallery, although obviously it's very historical, it's about the 18th century, that's really a commitment, that gallery. You were saying this museum upholds the values of the Enlightenment, and in a way is a kind of extension of the Enlightenment project, of a kind of responsibility to the world, but also a kind of desire to know the world and comprehend it in every sense of that word. I should say the first thing we do with our students on the course that I run, so a course about design history at the V&A that we share with the Royal College of Art. So this course begins with a field trip to the Enlightenment Gallery, and we talk about those objects as design objects, and we talk about what they might, what one might say about them if they were at the V&A instead of at the BM. But for you, it's a real kind of, I almost want to say, an ideological space, that gallery.
No, it's totally an ideological space. It's a definition, it's a statement of what the museum is. And I think one of the interesting questions to ask in terms of the V&A is, does the V&A feel more secure, potentially, in what it actually is a museum of?
More secure than you?
Than we do. That in a sense, we need, because a culture history museum is, certainly in a British context, a quite unusual beast, and that it's probably poorly understood by both the public and our political funders than perhaps what the V&A. The V&A has a quite clear, I argue, statement about what it's there to do.
Absolutely. I think we're quite clear on what we do. We are the world's leading museum of design. That's what we say. Of course, one can ask the question, what is design anyway? But I think one of the things that I find fascinating about the V&A is that it has that clarity, partly because the material that it collects, and obviously we do collect sculpture and photography at a very, very high level, but I think what most people associate with us is the concept of decorative arts, or design, what used to be called the minor arts in the 19th century. And so the V&A has this slightly outsider quality, at the same time as being, obviously one of the world's largest and most powerful and most central institutions, and as I said, a museum of empire in the past. It also has this great quality that I love of being a kind of a bootstrapping organization, a kind of, an organization that's can do and needs to constantly prove itself against the fine art focus that you might have at the Tate, or the world culture focus that you have, or lack of focus, that you might have at the BM. We need to constantly prove to people that teapots and frocks are worth looking at. And that seems to me to be the mission of the museum on some level.
It's interesting you think you need to constantly need to tell people to come and see teapots.
I think we do. I think, for one thing, there's the obvious point that people think they have a teapot at home. And so you have to say this is a very special teapot indeed. And that gets us back to that question of quality we were talking about upstairs, which I think is different for our two institutions, this question of quality. But also there's the question of fashionability. I think the V&A needs to remake itself, reinvent itself every once in a while to seem like we're still on the cutting edge, and we are the most stylish museum in London, even if we don't have the most expensive objects, or we don't have the largest collection, or we can't tell people stories about all kinds of cultures all across the world. We have the kind of hip factor, I suppose, and that's quite conscious at the museum, I would say. Recently, the kind of engagement with celebrity has been very interesting. The exhibition about Kylie that we did, for example, but also the focus on fashion is very important for us. And you don't have anything that quite fills that same slot at the BM.
No, and I don't think we would necessarily feel we need to. And for us, the crucial question is, how do you articulate a collection to tell global stories? And how do you use objects which have been collected in quite different contexts, which sit in very different departments with their own quite different histories of what they do and why they collect. So how do you use objects to construct the narratives? And crucially, that's about deciding what the narratives are going to be. And it is about making a clear choice about what storylines you're going to tell about the world, recognising that if you're going to tell one storyline, you can't necessarily tell another. But also, I think, clearly recognising that any public narrative you make about the global is going to be controversial. And I don't know what you feel about, in the sense that to me, the essence of curating a collection is actually to have the nerve to make a statement. And if there's anything which is different between my role, say, as a curator and my role when I used to be a university academic, it is I can't equivocate. I can't necessarily surround my statements with all sorts of qualifications. I have to, as a curator, make the statement.
Yeah. As you can imagine, working on postmodernism, that comes up all the time, because we have to say postmodernism was this. We can't say postmodernism is all these things, go read these books, it's fascinating, it's a labyrinth. you'll love it. We have to say postmodernism was this on a text panel, and there's no
Isn't
subject.
there a wonderful contradiction about saying that about
Well,
postmodernism?
indeed. It's all about the absence of master narrative, you know. But this also brings me to this question that Luca Mala raised in the session earlier, which is this question of affirmation in the museum space, because also with postmodernism, we find that we put a lot of pressure on ourselves to tell people postmodernism is not this frightening monster, it's not this disease that academics had to get over in 1990 or so. It was in fact a very liberatory thing, and we have to stress the positive on a certain level. And he made the point that global narratives, of which one is postmodernism, but global narratives in general, insofar as they're presented in museums, tend to have that affirmative character, that positive character, and I think that is very true of the British Museum. It's not a museum about conflict in the main, it's a story about connections and kind of productivity in those connections.
No, I think you're right. I think there is, as you'll be aware, to make these sorts of public statements about global issues is steering around a whole series of potentially incredibly controversial issues. And I think there is a really fundamental question about then what types of narratives museums are telling. And not just say narratives we tell. If you think about say the narratives other museums tell, which effectively are multiculturalism, they are very particular narratives, and they are in effect constructing a particular view of the world, which may actually hide problems.
Absolutely. Face problems where they
and
really
there are
exist.
big challenges about how you then face up to those sorts of problems and difficult histories in museums, both in terms of the museum's own confidence to address those issues, but also what the public actually wants, and what politicians and other stakeholders want.
Yeah.
And that's it. We work in a very complicated situation where we have to balance a whole series of quite often very contradictory and competing demands of what the museum is about, and trying to steer a way through that and still maintain a clear sense of what it's doing in terms of telling a global narrative is the fundamental challenge of what we face certainly in the next 10 years.
You always have that before you, the politics of what you're doing in a museum, and I think that's one of the great things about it. And in some ways, the challenge is to get the kind of critical acuity that you have to have as a curator into the space and really encourage people to think critically, not only about the content that you're presenting them, but also about the actual experience that you're presenting to them, to get people to respond to what you're doing critically. So perhaps we might best leave it there, JD. Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.